In the Blender Basics course, we covered the modeling tools Inset, Knife, Bevel, Insert Edge Loop, Edge Slide, Subdivide, Extrude to Cursor, Fill, Make Face, Vertex Connect, Bridge Edge Loops, and Merge. If you need a refresher and are watching this on CG Cookie, I'll link to the lessons below, or you can also find them on YouTube. Those tools are super important and we will be using them, so I'd really recommend going back and watching those videos if you haven't already before moving on with this course. But in this lesson, we'll talk about a few new tools that are going to be really helpful when working with our models. One of the ones that I will remind you about, though, is the difference between Fill, Connect, and Make Face. These three are easy to get confused and trip beginners up all the time. So I want to make sure I'm really stressing the difference here. First, let's talk about Fill. If we have a hole in the mesh, and I'll just delete some of these faces first, delete and faces, then I'll select the loop that goes around it by Alt-left clicking. I can fill this in with the Fill tool like you might expect by going to Face and Fill. What's unfortunate about this tool, though, is that it only works with triangles. So it takes whatever hole you have and it does fill it, but it fills it with triangles. And while sometimes that's helpful, most of the time that's not what I want. It's usually more useful to fill the hole with an n-gon. So to do that instead, we can go to the Vertex menu and choose New Edge/Face from Vertices, which is the hotkey F. Now, since the hotkey is F, I'll often say, oh, just press F to fill, because it does a fill-like thing, but it's technically not the fill tool, but saying make New Edge/Face every time gets very tiring. So I'll just say use the hotkey F, and you'll know what I'm talking about. But this tool is actually incredibly versatile and can be used for a lot more than just this. So while it can make an n-gon when you select a loop around a hole, it can also take any selection of faces and just turn that into one big n-gon. So I can select all of these faces here and hit F to make an n-gon. Why would you ever want to do that? Well, one of the reasons is that n-gons stop loop cuts. So if I were to hit Control R and try to add a loop cut here, then it won't go all the way around. And sometimes that behavior is incredibly helpful because we might not want our loops to go onto a different part of the mesh, and so we can use a temporary n-gon to protect it. Now, Blender's smart enough to cut through an n-gon if it's just at the end of a loop. So if that's the only area between the start and the end, then Blender knows that it can cut right through. But if it encounters two n-gons, then it's not going to be able to make that cut. N-gons are also really helpful in conjunction with the knife tool. For example, if you make an n-gon, then you can just hit K and start the knife tool, and make whatever geometry you want, sitting directly on top of that n-gon. So I'll often make a big n-gon with F, and then make my own topology with K. Another extremely powerful way to use this tool is to select a single edge and make a face from that. So if I delete this n-gon, I'll delete that entire face, I can just select this top edge here, and since it has two edges that are connected to it that are both not connected to anything in the middle, if I just tap F, Blender's smart enough to know that these four vertices make up a quad, and that's what I want to fill. So instead of having to select those all manually and then hitting F, I can just select an edge and tap F. And if you have a whole string of those, then you can just keep tapping until you're done. The part that people get confused with, though, is making a new edge between two different vertices. Because if you have two different vertices, you can also hit F to make a new edge between them, which is exactly what it does. It makes a new edge, but it also doesn't do anything else. Meaning that the face here hasn't been split into two faces. We just have a face and an edge lying directly on top of it, which is pretty bad topology. So what we want to do most of the time when working on a surface is not make a new edge and put it on top of the face, we want to split the face itself. We can do that with a command called Connect Vertex Path. So if we select two vertices and go to Vertex and choose Connect Vertex Path or use the hotkey J, then it will split that into two faces. This is incredibly helpful because not only does it work with vertices that are right next to each other, I can also just select one vertex and one on a completely different side of the mesh and hit J, and it'll draw a line straight from one to the other, curving across the surface the entire way and making new vertices as it goes. So J is an incredibly powerful tool. The way I like to think about this is that if we have two vertices that are not connected to any faces, this is where we would want to use F because J doesn't do anything. It says we can't connect vertices, and that's because there's no face in between to split, but I can use F. However, when I'm working on a face or a set of faces, then I always want to use J. So definitely keep that in mind because when you have an edge just floating there on top of other faces, that can cause a lot of problems and it's pretty sneaky. Now, another incredibly helpful option is grid fill. So if we have a hole in a mesh, and let's say it's a pretty big hole, I'll actually just select all of these faces and hit delete and faces. If we fill this with one big n-gon, then I guess we could go through and use the knife tool to connect everything. But first of all, that's going to take a lot of time. And second of all, we're not going to be able to capture that curvature again. Once we merged this into one big n-gon, we lost all of that curved detail. And bringing back that curvature is going to be pretty tricky, unless we can actually use grid fill. So I'll delete that face. And to use grid fill, you have to select a loop that runs all the way around a hole. So you can't select part of it. It has to be the entire surrounding loop. And then you can just go to face and grid fill. Now, grid fill doesn't have a hotkey assigned to it by default, but I would definitely recommend doing that. You can just hover over it, right click and choose assign shortcut. And here I'll use the hotkey Shift F since that's not assigned to anything else, but I won't use that throughout the course because that's not default. But I will use it in this video because it's a lot more convenient. As you can see, not only did it fill in that area with a perfect grid, it also preserved the curvature based on the surrounding edges. If you don't want that behavior, you can turn off simple blending in the redo panel. But more often than not, having that blending is really, really nice. And you can construct a lot of things with grid fill. One thing to know about it though is that it sometimes doesn't work. For example, if I just delete all of these faces here, and let's say I use my knife tool and put in an extra vertex here, so one side can't fully connect to the other. If I select this whole loop, again use Shift F, it's going to give me an error. And that's because there are the wrong number of vertices and I can't create a perfect grid. So if that's the case, then you have to get rid of a loop or add a new one on the other side. In this case, I'll just slide that up and merge everything by distance. And now my grid fill works perfectly fine. Though sometimes it doesn't always guess the right number of spans and offset, so you might have to increase that and choose your rotation. In this case, it looks like we want 3. And you can change the rotation until that fits. But grid fill is a command I use all the time, so I definitely recommend checking it out. Next, I think we talked very briefly about dissolve instead of delete. When you hit the delete key, you can dissolve vertices, edges, and faces, but I don't think we talked about it in depth, and it's really, really helpful for working with topology. First, if you select some faces and choose dissolve faces, that's just going to make one big n-gon from them, but I don't usually use that option because I can do the same thing a whole lot faster just by tapping F like we looked at before. So I don't really use that one, but I do use the others quite a bit. If you think about what happens when we delete a vertex, it essentially gets rid of all of the components that are depending on that vertex. So this edge right here, or all 4 of these edges, all depend on this vertex. And if that vertex doesn't exist, then those edges can't exist either. And since these faces all depend on those edges, then if this vertex doesn't exist, then those faces can't either. So if I were to delete and vertices, it gets rid of that whole area. Well, what dissolve does is it gets rid of that vertex, but it keeps the surrounding faces. So if I go through and dissolve vertices, then it gets rid of the vertex, and since that vertex doesn't exist, then the edges can't either, but it's just filled in the surrounding area with a big n-gon. So this can be incredibly helpful if, for example, you want to delete a whole section of a loop. You can hit delete and dissolve edges, and they're gone. One thing you might have to check though is that dissolve vertices is turned on, because if you have that off, then the vertices will still exist, but the edges won't, and so you'll get these nasty n-gons. So you'll want to have that on pretty much all the time, but it is an option just in case you want to keep those vertices there. So dissolve is for getting rid of a component, but keeping the surrounding structure. In the Blender Basics, we talked a lot about merge, where we can combine vertices together by hitting the M key, and we have a bunch of different options, including by distance, which helps us get rid of doubles. If we have 2 vertices directly on top of each other, and we select that whole area, we can hit M and choose by distance, but it only works if both vertices are selected. And it looked like I selected both of them because I'm using a box select, but since in Blender what you see is what you select, one vertex is directly on top of the other one, and so I wasn't able to select both. So what I'll do is I'll hit Z and toggle X-ray. Now I'm able to select both, and by the way, you can tell that both are selected based on the highlighting. So if I select only one, you can see that only part of that little junction is highlighted. And I can hit Shift and select the other one as well. That's another way to do it. But once I have both of those, I can hit M and by distance, and now those are just one vertex, like so. Now the exact opposite of that operation is called a rip, where you take one vertex and split it into 2. So to do that, select a vertex, go to the vertex menu, and choose Rip Vertices. Then you need to click and drag and then you can drag one vertex out from the other one. The hotkey for that is V, and so you can do that a whole lot faster just by selecting a vertex, hitting V, that'll jump you right into the movement, and then you can left click to confirm. So you can do this not just for vertices, but you can also do this for edges. So if you want to separate one set of edges from another, just select them, hit V, and move your mouse. And then those edges are ripped just like a pair of jeans. A variation of this is a rip fill, which is where you do something similar, but you leave the gap in between connected with faces. So for that, let's go to Vertex, and let's choose Rip Vertices and Fill, or use the hotkey Alt-V. And now when I click and drag, it does the same thing, but it fills in the faces in between. So this can be really helpful for taking an edge and just kind of duplicating it and offsetting it a little bit. Again, using the hotkey Alt-V. I think we only use this one once or twice in the course, so it's not super common, but I do find it really helpful when I do need it.